Sit discussing it, the old folks just a bickering. They wouldn't believe they'd someday see electric lights a flickering. He'd seen, in fact, the great impact of the things we take for granted. When a whistle blew and everyone knew the guiding star had landed. Oh, my darling, the things we take for granted. When a whistle blew and everyone knew the guiding star had landed. The guiding star was a sumptuous car, an elegant side-wheel steamer. Cincinnati and New Orleans and the major towns between there. The guiding star was from afar, and like a star did twinkle. Her captain and crew were looked up to for always the latest wrinkle. Oh, my darling, and like a star did twinkle. Her captain and crew were looked up to for always the latest wrinkle. Star came down the river and she landed at Tell City and connected on board to a long power cord was honest to God electricity. The people on the street they couldn't believe caused such an incredible sensation. Mayor August Schreiber was so impressed he called for an official occasion. Oh, my darling, such an incredible sensation. Mayor August Schreiber was so impressed he called for an official occasion. All day long the happy throng lined up to go on board her. To see this sight, electric lights, just to stare and wonder. The captain was touched to see how much in every heart was yearning. To see the sight in broad daylight of electric lights a-burning. Oh, my darling, in every heart was yearning. To see the sight in broad daylight of electric lights a-burning. The mechanics band and the Californian city fathers and gentlemen and ladies and folks were there from the Tell City Chair back then in the 1880s. Everyone came for miles around down at the boat we're standing. The first electricity on the Ohio River to come to the Tell City landing. Oh, my darling, down at the boat we're standing. The first electricity on the Ohio River to come to the Tell City landing. Captain Hagler of the Guiding Star wanted to show the rest there his appreciation for the celebration in his most magnificent gesture. So at the high point of this great event as the afternoon slid towards nightfall, he made a speech and presented the mayor with a freshly burned out light bulb.
The river brought the Swiss Colonization Society to this spot in 1858 with the hope of building an industrial city. Tell City immediately began to grow, depending entirely on the river for its economic survival. This was true until 1889 with the coming of the railroad. The Ohio carried our ancestors from Cincinnati and New Orleans, arriving in this wharf boat. Fred Steiner was the first wharf master. The river supplied the town with goods, recreation, and it was their friend, their lifeline, a blessing, but it also brought disaster. Floods commonly occurred in late winter and early spring. They were considered nuisance floods. The low-land dwellers became adept at putting their meager furnishing up on scaffolds to keep them out of water's reach. A pattern of rising waters every 2 or 3 years did not prepare them for what was to come. In August 1875, the waters rose to 6 feet above flood stage and stayed in the low fields along 5th, 6th, and 7th Street for several weeks. Vegetables rotted in the fields, bringing a horrible stench. The slimy water bred millions of mosquitoes, and since few families had screens for the windows and doors were left open in the heat, malaria was rampant. Quinine was consumed in unheard-of quantities. The people rode dough in shapes of pills, inserted grains of quinine in the center of each, and dusted them in licorice powder in an attempt to mask the bitter taste. In 1882 and 83, floodwaters exceeded past records, and February 1884 brought a new crest of 50 feet and 6 inches, surpassing all previous records. Here in the foreground, we see the plank road between Franklin and Humboldt Streets. Mrs. Mary Dreiling notes in her diary,
"In January 1884, the Ohio River again became threatening, and in early February, August Schreiber, our first mayor, went from house to house to give warning of the coming flood. On February 20, the water began receding, and we were hoping for relief when the heaviest snowstorm I ever experienced began about 4 p.m. and continued through the night. All sorts of our buildings, sheds, and trees came flying by my house. The waves were hurled over my roof, and suddenly it was pitch dark outside, and you could hear the wind hurling. It was so cold, but I was afraid to light a fire. Heavy damage was done to all of the factories, also the Morawek Hotel, and the Anzeiger building barely escaped annihilation when the wharf boat came flying toward it."
Again in 1907, the river came out of its banks, but apparently by now citizens were determined to take advantage of the situation. In 1913, after early spring rains and thawing of heavy snows in the Allegheny Mountains, word came from upriver to prepare for a real inundation. All factory employees and owners worked diligently to get as much of their lumber and manufactured articles out of reach of the damaging waters as they could. On the roof, we see Mr. and Mrs. Henry Nimsgern, owners of the restaurant located on the southwest corner of Main and Washington Streets. Mr. and Mrs. Berger are seated to the left and are the owners of the First Picture Show. The movie house is located in the corner of the building. These ladies are perched atop the fountain in the yard of the depot between 7th and Bloom Streets. Here we see the corner of Main and Washington looking north. This was considered the worst flood our area would ever see, and for 24 years the river seemed to be less menacing with only a number of nuisance rises. But then on January 28, 1937, the Ohio sent its rampaging waters through the valley at a record crest of 56 feet 11 3/8 inches, 6 feet higher than in 1913. Week-long rains and warm winter temperatures in the Appalachians melted snow and caused the Ohio River to swell from its banks. The turbulent waters swallowed farmlands and river towns from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Cairo, Illinois. And here at home, Tell City's 14 industrial plants employing 1,380 people were valued at over $2 million. Inventory was valued at over $800,000. The payroll exceeded $1 million. 102 mercantile establishments employed 302 people. Losses to these establishments exceeded $945,000. Henry Alf, an employee of Tell City Sand and Gravel Company, kept a daily record of the river stages. From January 14th to January 25th, a total of 13 inches had fallen. The river rose steadily and swiftly. By the time it stopped raining on January 26th, a crest of 80 feet was recorded at Cincinnati. 3 days later in Tell City, the river crested at 56 feet 11 3/8 inches. At Main and Pestalozzi Streets, water was 9 feet 7 inches above the sidewalk. A new post office building had been built high above the 1913 mark, yet the water was 3 feet above floor level. The stone wall on Main Street side of City Park was covered with skiffs and boats of every description. On Thursday, January 21st at 9:13 p.m., the high water extinguished the fires under the boilers at the Ohio River Power Company and would soon reach the turbines. All power and water service was discontinued, not to return for 4 long weeks. On Friday, Mayor Ed Schultz received word from the State Health Department to boil all drinking water. Relief efforts were undertaken by the U.S. Forest Service and the 108 boys of the Civilian Conservation Corps. They rescued more than 30 people from flooded homes and 10 aged invalids from upper floors. More than $100,000 worth of property was saved by the men of the Forest Service and the CCC. They waded through water and mud, working in sleet and in bitter cold. For 3 hectic days they battled the impossible to save what they could. In the end, one boy lost his life to pneumonia as a result of exposure. Food, clothing, shoes, and bedding arrived by truck from every city and hamlet upstate. The monks of St. Meinrad sent 300 loaves of bread. Water was brought daily in trucks from Indianapolis and Huntingburg. Tell City was a central distribution point for the supplies brought in by Red Cross boats. The American Legion and veterans of foreign wars aided the Red Cross. Members C.F. Shelton, Alfred Clemens, Erdix B. Ewing, and Joseph McMahon were in charge of housing and clothing. Phone service was disconnected, so the only contact to the outside world was through the Forest Service wire to Paoli for emergency calls. However, Tell City was not without newspapers for a single day. The Evansville papers were trucked in daily, which was not an easy task. The usual 50-mile trip became 200 miles. The local courier truck met another truck at Dale, which came there via Newburgh, Boonville, and Linville. The Dale truck then came to St. Croix and Tell City. Those who had car radios could tune in to hear ham operators and broadcasting stations from Louisville and other cities directing rescue workers to various points. A company of Indiana National Guardsmen was sent from Frankfort to help in control of possible vandalism, to aid the local fire company in guarding against fires, and to direct traffic. These soldiers were billeted in the Consolidated School on Tell Street, present-day junior high. Fire Chief Fred Franz and 24 of his firemen stayed on duty 24 hours a day to guard against fires, protect property, and aid in rescue. At 9 p.m. each night, a guard would ring the Newman School bell to announce the curfew. Guards walked the streets all night, and no one was to be out past the curfew. Even Mayor Schultz was stopped one evening while trying to enter his store. The Sea Scouts, headed by Jerome Richard, aided by the U.S. Forest Service and the CCC in emptying and flooded business places. They all acted as messengers from various relief offices, and in the absence of printing presses, they mimeographed and distributed Red Cross bulletins and supplies. City Hall became the main lifeline used by the Red Cross. Chaired by Chris Zerker, Dr. P.J. Coltis was in charge of medical aid and nursing, flood relief, transportation, and equipment. Offices of the State Board of Health were here. They registered those refugees who were no longer able to live in their homes, and some of them actually lived in City Hall. Miss Ida Buchser noted in her diary,
Saturday, January 23rd, Lady Baumeister Bauer had to be chloroformed to get her out of her house. The water had reached the second floor, and her bed now stood in water, but she refused to leave her home. On January 24, Charles Shergans died about 2 p.m., and a baby was born in City Hall.
Military headquarters were in the Moose Home. The food distribution center was at Newman School. Food brought in by Coast Guard cutters was distributed from St. Paul School to those still able to cook at home. The Evangelical Church was turned over to the Red Cross for a serving of 300 meals daily. Mrs. Alma Kennedy and Miss Bertha Steinauer directed 60 assistants in the dispensing of clothing. Mrs. Charles Hughes was in charge of housing and also did practical nursing. Reverend H. H. Peters, pastor of the church, worked entirely in this undertaking. Vic Weisenberger, superintendent of the water department, aided the state health board representatives in the purification of water and milk supplies, provided immunizations, rehabilitation, and furnished nurses for flood victims. Miss Leona Adams was the public health nurse of Tipton and was called back to Tell City to act as head nurse. Miss Teresa Beimel, employed in Evansville, also returned. Miss Buchser writes in her diary,
Wednesday, January 27. 4 cases of pneumonia were reported at the Methodist Church. On Thursday, January 28, a terrible new kind of fever has appeared. It will be compulsory to get shots.
When the water began to subside, it was time to clean up. Not an easy task. On Thursday, February 4th, a rehabilitation committee consisting of manufacturers and merchants met with Governor W. Clifford Townsend and Assistant WPA Director Charles Wilson of Tell City. They asked the WPA to furnish labor and aid to clean the local plants. On Friday, February 5th, Dr. Coltis, County Health Commissioner, reported that 7,693 people have been immunized against typhoid in Perry County. Ms. Buchser notes in her diary,
On February 6th, Valmer Franz and his wife left for Washington to attend the inauguration. They were caught in the flood in Louisville, and no one has heard from them. Someone said they were put into quarantine.
As the water subsided, people rallied together to begin sweeping, mopping, and disposing of mud. Damage to beautiful wood floors, ruined pianos, and many other precious items was heartbreaking. Main Street still had about 2 feet of water, and the No. 1 Chair Factory office was under hip-boot-high water. Ed Shergens was trying to clean the linotype at the news office with cold, dirty water. Hans Steins were carrying out mud-caked clothing. Clara Steinauer and Citizens National Bank President Sam Anderson borrowed a wringer washer to wash and wring paper money before they ironed it. In 18-degree weather and blowing wind, people worked to clean mud and ice from lumber at the chair company. Miss Buchser notes in her diary on Thursday, February 11th.
I cleaned all day at Franklin School, and then Superintendent Glenn Traw came with some disinfecting powder, and we cleaned it all again. I was sick all night from the second shot, and my hands were raw from those 2 barrels of stinky water. It ate all the skin off my hands. I wished I could die, where I worked so hard just for nothing.
Almost every house that was not flooded was filled with company. The Moose Home had open house, welcoming everyone. Ed Shergens wrote in the March 5th William Tell Says column that tonsorial artists George Shibley and Wilbur Berger set up their businesses in the basement. At first they could not bring their barber chairs from George's shop, so customers reclined in a lawn chair for a shave and sat in a dining room chair for a haircut. Businesses sat up wherever they could. The U.S. Coast Guard sent 5 picket boats with crews to aid in rescue. These boats were called rum runners because they were used during Prohibition to seize illegal rum shipments coming into the U.S. from Cuba. These powerful boats churned the water so much that they damaged buildings, causing the west wall of the woolen mill to collapse. Mike Bettinger was trying to help support the roof. While doing so, he lost his toupee in the water. After much difficulty, it was fished out and dried. The picture shows Mike in his sailboat in the 200 block of Front Street. Dick Winchell and Emmett Hess of the Dick and Emmett Tire Company took a boat to look into their place of business. While doing so, the John boat capsized, throwing them both into 6 feet of water. Dick managed to keep his head above water, but Emmett was too short. He finally managed to stand on a windowsill to keep from drowning. They finally pulled themselves to safety. This photo shows the 1948 flood wall after the wall was built. Notice how high the water is in relation to the wall. Tell City learned the lesson well. The U.S. Haim Company moved away from Tell City after this flood. Perry County evacuated 800 families. 900 homes had some water damage. 300 homes suffered severe damage. 75 homes were totally destroyed. The Ohio River Valley suffered 135 deaths and property losses of nearly $400 million. 1 million people were left homeless.